мы проводим первое мероприятие в таком очно-заочном формате. Это просто замечательная новость. Мы постепенно переходим в режим нормальной работы, постепенно выходим из тех ограничений, которые на нас накладывала пандемия. Мы все еще вынуждены наш зал оставлять наполовину пустым и совмещать с дистанционным форматом, но уже постепенно идем к нормальной работе. Back to normality, как сказали бы наши зарубежные коллеги. Сегодня мы проводим очень интересное мероприятие «Перспектива сотрудничества России и ЕС в области экологии». Мы проводим его совместно с компанией CREON. Я хочу сказать, что мы очень много сделали и по треку отношений России и ЕС, и у нас богатый опыт сотрудничества с CREON, и в рамках целого ряда наших проектов мы сегодня рассчитываем на самый откровенный и профессиональный обмен мнениями по данной проблематике. И позвольте мне передать слово президенту Российского совета по международным делам Игорю Сергеевичу Иванову для открытия нашей сегодняшней конференции. Игорь Сергеевич, пожалуйста. Игорь Сергеевич, звук, микрофон. Да, все.
Good morning, good afternoon. I don't know if Ambassador Federer is there, but dear colleagues, the Russian International Affairs Council, together with the CREON Group, is launching a new project on environmental and climate issues within the framework of relations between Russia and the European Union. The idea of the project is to outline through a frank dialogue of experts the opportunities of the mutual beneficial cooperation that open up in connection with strategic decisions that are taken in the field of environmental protection. Unfortunately, political relations between Russia and the European Union have reached an impasse and cannot get out of it. This is sorry state, since the current crisis in our relations objectively limits the opportunities for both sides to respond to the current challenges in an effective manner. The fight against the pandemic is the most obvious example of this. At the same time, our planet is facing an increasing number of problems that demand our urgent reaction if we are to avoid the catastrophic consequences. Climate change is one of such priorities for every country. Russia is closely monitoring the implementation of the European Union Green Deal proclaimed by Brussels. This is understandable, since any change in the European economic policy cannot but affect the interests of Russia, given the high level of economic interdependence. Innovations in European economic policy are considered in Russia mainly in the context of potential risks. This applies to the carbon customs duties, to the possible reduction of Russian energy supplies to Europe, and others. Such concerns cannot be ignored or simply dismissed if we want to maintain mutually beneficial cooperation. Therefore, it's important now, along with expressing legitimate concerns, to jointly consider the new opportunities for cooperation that are opening up. This is also important for economic reforms in Russia itself. One can treat the European Green Deal in different ways. There are active discussions around it even in Europe itself. At the same time, it's quite obvious that environmental issues are not a fad, but an important element of the economic transformations that are gaining momentum in the world. The COVID pandemic only accelerates these processes. The task of Russia and the European Union is to keep up with these processes and use the new opportunities for cooperation that are opening up. We very much hope that our project will be able to contribute to this task. I wish you all an interesting and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor Sergeyevich, for your introductory notes. And let me now pass the floor to the diplomats from the Russian and the EU sides for their reflection of the issue. And with this, I would like to pass the floor to Artem Yurievich Bulatov, the Deputy Director of the Department for the Cooperation in Europe of the MFA of Russia. Artem Yurievich, пожалуйста.
Thank you. Thank you. Уважаемый Игорь Сергеевич, dear colleagues, good afternoon. I hope you are doing well in the present pandemic environment. Let me express my sincere gratitude to the Russian International Affairs Council and personally to its president, Igor Sergeyevich Ivanov, for organizing this event. It's good to have an opportunity to discuss the current situation, current state of play and prospects of the Russia-EU interaction in the climate sphere. The global pandemic has just highlighted that what we have long been talking about, that all countries, without exception, are interconnected, regardless of their geography, size, or level of economic development. All of us have been affected to a great extent. The pandemic has clearly demonstrated that cross-border issues cannot be disregarded in this globalized world. Now we must help global economy to go through this difficult period and ensure its consistent post-COVID development. This goal should unite us because this is all about the welfare of all our nations. We firmly believe that it is in our common interest to prevent the appearances of undesirable dividing lines in the new economic spheres created by the technological shift. Energy and industry are becoming ever greener, and all spheres of human activity are being digitalized. There is an international consensus on the issue of combating climate change. Both Russia and the European Union are committed to implementation of the Paris Agreement. Russia is ready to limit its greenhouse gas emissions to 70% of the 1990 level. But solidarity and fairness should be at heart of any cooperation on climate issues. Combating climate change is about building bridges, not barriers. Protectionism and restrictions will only aggravate the situation, which is already complicated enough. I think everyone has noticed that the pandemic has brought certain new opportunities. They must be used to strengthen economies of our countries. We expect everybody to come to the same conclusions that common tasks and challenges should bring all of us together based on universally recognized norms of international law. Regrettably, this has not happened so far. Quite the opposite. Some of our Western partners have tried to take advantage of the corona crisis to promote their narrow interests even more energetically. It's absolutely natural that in the current situation, all countries are looking for new sources of economic growth. And it appears that some of our partners cannot resist the temptation to instrumentalize climate agenda for the benefit of their economies. It goes without saying that the Russian side is closely following the elaboration of the format and content of the key element of the European Green Deal, so-called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is set to be enacted not later than on January the 1st, 2023, in one form or another. Given the established trade and investment ties between Russia and the EU, we are naturally interested in maintaining the existing production chains and supply channels once the mechanism is introduced. For now, we are looking into what this initiative will actually comprise. Of course, we expect the EU to fully comply with its international obligations. It is important to develop a mechanism that fully meets the standards of international trade, takes into account the efforts of Russian producers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase their carbon absorption capabilities, as well as the contribution of our country to global climate actions. We do hope that carbon border adjustment mechanism would not contradict the WTO rules and will not lead to trade protectionism on climate issues. We would like to avoid having to take retaliatory measures. We believe now it's not the time for trade wars, even in the current geopolitical environment. We also took note of the plans to use carbon border adjustment mechanism as an additional source of income for the EU budget. It is estimated to bring annually up to 15 billion euro. And it seems to be more about economy rather than ecology. And frankly speaking, it goes fully in line with the EU's pattern of protectionism in the trade sphere. The European Commission has recently published a report on significant distortions in the economy of the Russian Federation for the purpose of trade defense investigations. Most of our colleagues probably know what this is all about. The document is clearly biased and can lead to new unjustified restrictions on access of Russian goods to the EU market. Certain facts and conclusions presented in this report concerning various sectors of Russian economy, energy, transport, steel, aluminum, chemicals, labor market, are either incorrect or questionable. Another example, and probably even a more illustrative one. Last year, the EU took advantage of the WTO appellate body crisis to avoid enforcement of the WTO panel of arbitrators decision in favor of the Russian Federation on the WTO dispute concerning EU cost adjustment methodologies. We are disappointed with such actions of our EU partners. We believe that this step runs counter the EU statements about the need to comply with the WTO rules. Thus, the EU is effectively obstructing justice by trying to extend illegal practices to protect its uncompetitive producers. We expect that with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it won't be the case. And this is not only our perception of situation. Earlier this month, the WTO Council of Trade in Goods addressed the issue of carbon border adjustment mechanism. Position that protectionist measures under the pretext of combating climate change are unwarranted, and that such measures should be consistent with the EU's international obligations under both WTO and climate agreements, was supported by more than 20 WTO members, representing over 40% of world trade, including the United States, Canada, China, India, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf countries, Southeast Asia, and Latin American countries. Despite that, the EU is consistently declining to discuss the issue with its partners. We understand that nothing is settled until everything is settled, but it is in the EU interest to launch consultations on the matter as soon as possible. And here we come to the most sticking point, the channels of communication and mechanism of cooperation. It so happened that Brussels, under the far-fetched pretext, renounced systemic work with Russia in year 2014. All institutions and the entire architecture of our cooperation that had been evolving for years, including the dialogue on environment, was demolished. We repeatedly hear loud statements from the EU representative calling on us to combine efforts in the spheres of common interest, be it climate, healthcare, renewable sources of energy, or digital transformation. But to put it bluntly, such statements do not correspond to the real actions of our partners. Brussels persists in its short-sighted policy aimed at curtailing practically all stable formats of cooperation of our country. We see a clear attempt to reduce our bilateral interaction on climate issues to joint participation in round tables, multilateral events, and to sporadic contacts with Russian institutions. Such de facto simulation of close engagement with our country cannot in any way substitute a structured dialogue, whatever it is called, dialogue, working groups, or regular expert consultations. It is in everyone's interest to look for common ground, to consolidate human, scientific, technical, and resource capacities of Russia and the EU in the face of serious global issues like combating climate change. We are ready for cooperation on the broadest possible basis. All our proposals are on the table, but we won't knock on closed doors. The ball is in the EU's court. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Artem Yuryevich. And now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Laurent Bardon, the head of the Economic and Trade section of the delegation of the EU to Russia, for his reflection and the reflection of the EU on the issue we discussed today. Please, Mr. Bardon, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Ambassador Igor asked me to apologize for his absence today, but I would certainly like to thank you, RIAC, and especially Mr. Igor Ivanov, but also CREON, Mr. Kildier, for setting up this dialogue. I think it's a great idea, and our colleague of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has obviously demonstrated at length that we need to talk to each other. I will not answer to everything that the Minister of Foreign Affairs just said, because I think I wouldn't speak climate very much. Let me just remind that when the High Representative, Mr. Borrell, visited Moscow early February, he came with proposals for a structured dialogue. Unfortunately, he was not given a chance by Minister Lavrov to express his views during their bilateral meeting. In the same way, I remember that both the minister and the HRVP mentioned climate as an area for bilateral cooperation at their joint press conference. But of course, the choreography organized by the ministry around the visit sent a very different message back to Brussels. And that we all know that. So I will stop there and try to speak climate, something that the ministry hardly touched upon. First, to say that we are already doing a number of things on climate between Russia and the EU. We have a productive cross-border cooperation and Northern Dimension projects that are common to Russia and the EU, but also a number of partners outside Russia and the EU, which are increasingly touching upon environment and climate matters. But of course, they stop short of the task we have at hand, which is to tackle climate change. For the EU, of course, since the Green Deal that was approved well before the pandemic, late 2019, we have a strong ambition of becoming climate neutral by 2050. And we also decided to increase the level of ambition for 2030 and to have a decrease of 55% of emission by 2030. Russia, with 5% of global greenhouse gases emissions, is the world's 5th largest emitter country after China, the US, the EU, and India. Relative to its population and GDP, its emissions are higher than most of these partners. While energy accounts for more than 75% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, Russia is the world's 2nd largest oil and gas producer and the 3rd biggest coal exporter. So Russia matters, the EU is moving, and I believe that climate is increasingly shaping our relations and will increasingly shape them. We are both members of the Paris Agreement, we are neighbors, but our economies also are interdependent. And Executive Vice President Timmermans, when he spoke at the EU-Russia Climate Conference in December, stressed that we should have understanding for each other as we are energy exporter and energy consumer. Still, Russia is not ambitious enough. And my colleague of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs didn't speak a lot about Russian efforts in climate. So let me remind everybody of a few facts. Pursuant to Presidential Decree 666 of last November, which became Russia's national determined contribution before the United Nations, Russia shall ensure by 2030 a reduction of greenhouse gas emission to 70% compared to 1990 levels. This maximum level of emissions by 2030 is well above Russia's current level of emissions, which in 2017 were around 50%. In other words, Russia allows itself to worsen global warming for the next 10 years. The same goes with longer-term reduction. The EU, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, together with many more countries, have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050. China said it will do so before 2060. But when it comes to Russia, even under the most ambitious scenario of its draft long-term low-carbon development strategy, the country's emissions would at best be roughly the same in 2050 as they are today. Another important point is the future law on limiting greenhouse gas emissions. According to a declaration in October of Minister Reshetnikov, with that law, Russia only follows the path of introducing soft carbon regulation through the introduction of a monitoring system with no plan to introduce a carbon tax. I think Russia must be the only G20 country not to have a plan for a carbon tax. It therefore seems that the law will lack of any strong incentive mechanism that could really constrain to a reduction of emissions. I could also mention forestry, where the Ministry of Natural Resources and Ecology recently introduced changes to the methodology for determining the absorption volume of greenhouse gas by Russian forests. Several press articles reported that business circles and the government would count on this mere methodological change to increase Russia's reported greenhouse gas absorption by forests by up to 1 gigaton of CO2 per year, meaning that Russia would go from the 5th to the 7th or 8th world emitter. In that respect, we would like to stress the importance that Russia remains in line with IPCC standards and improves the quality of its reporting. What matters is that Russia effectively improve the absorption capacity of its forest on the ground in the real world and not through accounting tricks. So when we see on the one hand the EU, but not just the EU, China, Japan, South Korea, moving fast in the direction of climate neutrality and the lack of ambition on the Russian side, there is indeed a risk that Russia and the EU would diverge. With a risk that it would become an irritant. I would like now to come to the subject raised at length by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the CBAM. We see signs of Russia trying the easy and probably illusory way out of stopping it before the WTO and lobbying against it with others. This Russia does before the initiative is even defined in a legislative proposal of the European Commission, in spite of the EU's assurances that any CBAM will be WTO compatible. And without Russia pursuing the much more promising path of efficiently reducing its own carbon emissions with its own carbon pricing mechanism, giving it real chances to reduce, if not avoid, the CBAM, while at the same time acting for climate. So additional non-EU countries are also considering a CBAM, which further demonstrates the legitimacy, the need, and the legal soundness of this initiative. The CBAM will take into account efforts by our international partners, such as Russia, to adopt policies and measures which effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions from industrial production. Importers will be treated in an even-handed manner and will not be subject to an adjustment that is higher than what is applied domestically. The services of the European Commission are completing a thorough assessment of impacts of various CBAM options, such as a system mirroring the EU ETS or an internal carbon excise charge. The assessment of the options will not only look into their economic, social, and environmental impacts, but will also consider feasibility and practical implementation, administrative burdens, and compliance costs. The assessment of the European Commission also includes a careful and meaningful selection of sectors and products that should be subject to the CBAM from the outset, reflecting also the possibility of extending the scope to other products later in the implementation. Indeed, a clear and stable investment climate is necessary to make the appropriate carbon abatement investment decisions. Last but not least, the EU wishes to work with Russia to promote effective methods of decarbonization, from technological innovation to market-based approaches. Our ambassador, Mr. Ederer, has had several positive discussions with Mr. Edelgayev, advisor to President Putin and special presidential representative on climate issues. We have also contacts with the Ministry of Economic Development, and the Association of European Businesses has set up a green initiative to help us and EU companies reach out to Russian companies and stakeholders. Russia has all the resources, human and natural, with talented scientists and engineers, with plenty of wind and sun, to take full advantage of a switch to decarbonized methods of production and new ways of life. The potential to improve the energy efficiency and renewable energy is huge. Climate smart forestry and forest-based products also have great potential to mitigate climate change in Russia. The development of hydrogen is also emerging as a very promising area on which to extend EU-Russia relations. The pilot project to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions by 2025 in the Sakhalin Oblast seems to combine many of these very promising elements. I had the occasion of learning more about this project around 10 days ago, and we are working with headquarters on this. So, to repeat what Executive Vice President Timmermans said, of course it was before the visit of the HRVP, but still, that we believe EU and Russia have to cooperate on climate. We are ready to do it, but we have to talk climate. And as I can see, sometimes Russian partners, and we heard our colleague from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, forget to talk about climate. The subject is climate. How do we do that together? We are ready to do it. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. So we had the reflections from the side of diplomats, and now we are proceeding to expert reflections, both from the EU and the Russian side. And with this, let me pass the floor to Mr. Rem Kortrijk, our colleague from Klingendael from the Netherlands, who is a senior fellow at Klingendael. Rem, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and very good to see you, even though you're behind a face mask. And it's a bit of a shame I'm not able to join you today in Moscow to join you for this very interesting conversation. A lot has already been said regarding the EU's approach to climate and trade. And so at the risk of repeating what Monsieur Bardon was referring to, let me touch upon what I think are 3 or 4 key issues that require or that deserve your EU-Russian dialogue in the context of climate. I think it's a foregone conclusion that the Green Deal that the European Union has launched, that is very ambitious. The CO2 emission reduction targets that the EU has set itself are very ambitious. There is debate about whether it is ambitious enough. There is debate inside the EU whether it goes too far. But in itself, the Green Deal is now a fact of life in the European Union. It is a policy that is being implemented, and governments of the individual EU member states are taking steps to meet the ambitions. I think what is important to realize with the Green Deal is that inevitably it is going to lead to decarbonization. And sure, we can debate the specifics, how quickly that's going to happen or not, but the trend is in one direction. And that trend is to reduce the EU's reliance on hydrocarbons for its energy and its energy production and for its economic activities. And as a major hydrocarbons exporter like Russia, I think it's very logical that that raises questions, and that also raises the necessity for dialogue, for a better understanding. But I think that this is a sovereign decision by the EU and its member states, that this is the way the wind is blowing, and that regardless of what Russia or the United States or China think about this, this is policy that is being put in action inside the European Union. Secondly, one of the concerns that is now being raised in the context of the EU's trade policy is the problem of carbon leakage. And this, of course, informs what's already been mentioned, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It is not meant as a tool of protectionism, although I can understand the logic in how that comes across, but the idea is to address carbon leakage precisely to ensure a level playing field internationally when it comes to sustainable and ecologically friendly production standards. And so the EU is working on a carbon border adjustment mechanism or a carbon border tax, and there are still discussions ongoing how to ensure that it is WTO compliant. I think this is one of the main puzzles that the EU now confronts itself, how to actually make it WTO compliant. But since we don't have the full draft proposal yet, it's very difficult to now already judge whether it is or it is not. It is, in fact, the outset, the precondition for the carbon border tax to ensure that it is WTO compliant. And for what it's worth, I do believe it will be. One of the reasons it will be is also something that Monsieur Bardon mentioned, is that effectively, as far as I understand it, the CBAM will simply be a mirror of what the EU internally domestically does in terms of its emission trading system. And so countries that have a comparable emission trading system would not, or in some respects, there would be divergence in terms of how the carbon border tax would apply to them. It is mainly a concern probably for those countries that do not have a domestic emission trading system of their own. And that, again, requires, I think, more explanation and debate and dialogue between the EU and Russia. There is, of course, also a question, and this goes to the implementation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, when it is enacted in the 1st of January 2023, which sectors it would address, which sectors would be covered. And we've seen a whole range of sectors being mentioned. There were initial proposals to actually start with a pilot, to only cover 1 or 2 sectors to see how it works. But we also see that there are now, there's an ambition from the European Parliament to ensure that it covers actually all areas where also the EU's emission trading system applies. And that would mean that effectively all energy intensive sectors like cement, steel, aluminium, oil, refinery, paper, glass, chemicals, fertilizer, even the aviation sector would be covered initially. Now, if I were a petrochemical exporter based in Russia, exporting to the European Union, I would want to know more about this. And I would try to understand. But I would also try to ensure that my own ability to continue to export to the European Union in light of a carbon border tax would still be preserved. And so I do think that this also raises questions for Russia's own climate agenda. It's worth noting, however, that the jury is still out how the carbon border adjustment mechanism will look. It's not done and dusted. We also see that there is a vibrant transatlantic discussion about this. The United States also wants to introduce a border tax of some sort. It's a question whether the EU and the United States can align on this, whether they can form a carbon group, if you will, or whether they're going to do this separately. We've also seen John Kerry already make statements that he would be opposed to the European Union doing this unilaterally. That suggests that there is also room that the transatlantic partners move on this in sync. In other words, this is still very much a space which is fluid and is moving. But I think it's also a foregone conclusion that it is going in one direction and that the EU is very much intent on installing a carbon border tax. Let me make two very short final points, Ivan, if I may. And that is where I think there is also room for more dialogue between the EU and Russia on issues connecting to climate policy. One is the Arctic. The Arctic is oftentimes seen as a topic that deserves broader discussion, but we never really get to it. It's always mentioned as an issue to talk about. We rarely actually do that. Now, the climate crisis that we currently face raises huge questions about the future of the Arctic. And I do think that the European Union and Russia have a shared responsibility to ensure that science and research, maritime security, but also the economic opportunities emerging from an opening up of the Arctic are managed in a responsible, sustainable, and peaceful way. So I would recommend a lot more of that, if you please. Finally, and an issue slightly tangentially related to the topic on today's agenda, but very much close to the climate issue, is the issue of climate security. What is the impact of climate change on security, on migratory flows, on peace and instability in regions that are not necessarily in the EU or in Russia, but are close to our homes? This is an area where I think still much more research needs to be done. And I think this is a shared concern from both the European Union and Russia to understand how climate change is also going to change the geopolitics and the security situation of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ram, for your presentation. Please send our best regards to all of our colleagues in Klingendahl, Tony Vandertot, and all the others. So now I'm passing the floor to have the Russian expert view on the issue, and we have Igor Alexeyevich Makarov as our guest today. He's the head of the Department for World Economy and the head of the Laboratory for the Economy of Climate Change at the High School of Economics. Igor, please, can you hear us?
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor for me to make presentations here in this very respectable meeting. I will provide some of my reflections about the cooperation and at the same time the possible confrontation of Russia and Europe in the green area. Of course, I want to start with the statement that the European Green Deal is a very ambitious initiative, and of course it will make a great contribution in prevention of climate change, into coping with one of the greatest challenges the humanity faces in the 21st century. And so, of course, as was mentioned already many times in the previous speeches, it would be a challenge for Russia. It would be a challenge for the Russian exports of hydrocarbons, because Russian economy is very dependent on fossil fuels exports, including the fossil fuel exports to the European Union, and it certainly provides some room for possible confrontation about within this agenda, because of course, the initial interests between two parties are very different, and it should be understood by both parties, I think. Here is a slide which shows potential decreases of exports of Russian coal and Russian natural gas to the European Union in different scenarios. The first scenario is business as usual scenario, the scenario without any policy measures to reduce emissions in the European Union. And red and green scenarios show the scenarios with the efforts to reduce emissions in the European Union. Red scenario shows what would be with Russian exports if the European Union will follow its INDC, so the decrease of emissions by 40% by 2030. The aim, which was already revised to minus 55% compared to the 1990 level. And the green scenario shows what would be with Russian exports of fossil fuels in the case if the European Union will follow 2-degree trajectory, which is correspondent to the objectives of the European Green Deal, carbon neutrality by 2050. And it is a challenge for Russia, of course, but it is also a challenge for the European Union because, for the EU-Russia relations, of course, because the independence in the deliveries of fossil fuels was in the core of the EU-Russian relations. And we lived with this interdependence for already more than half of a century. Of course, the EU-Russia relations would be very different from what we had for the last decades if this fossil fuel interdependence will change. Of course, the question which is the issue which is the most debatable in Russia right now, which is the most widely discussed, is the CBAM, which was also mentioned many times today. There are very active discussions in Russia about the potential response of Russian companies and the Russian government on this initiative. There are many estimates of potential losses for Russian exporters in case if the European Union introduces this mechanism by 2022 or 2023. The estimates vary a lot. They vary from about $1 or $2 billion per year to absolutely astronomical numbers, about $50 billion per year. I think that these estimates are overestimated. Actually, these numbers are overestimated. The real losses of the Russian exports or exporters would be much less. But however, the reason why the estimates are so different is that the European Union did not provide any clearness on how exactly the carbon border adjustment mechanism is introduced. And this is a large problem because there are different signals from different institutions within the EU. There are some signals from the European Parliament, which proposes to be much more ambitious in introducing this mechanism. There are also signals from the European Commission and from different think tanks that say that the European Union should start with a very modest initiatives, pilot schemes for some sectors, and not the whole carbon footprint should be covered by this additional carbon tax, but only the excess over the European benchmark and so on. So there are very, very different signals, and this is a problem for adjustment of the Russian economy to this situation. Moreover, I think that it is a huge oversimplification from the perspective of the European Union that the introduction of CBAM would help other countries and would incentivize other countries to introduce more active climate policies. It is not actually the case. And I can't say that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a huge incentive for Russia to introduce more active climate policies, because business, which would suffer from this European regulation, it says that we will pay already to the European Union if you introduce the carbon regulation within the country, within Russia. So it will be possible that we will pay twice, because there are huge risks that Russia and the European Union can't agree to each other to what extent the possible regulation in Russia would be taken into consideration by the European Union. And I understand this business. They really are afraid that they will pay twice if the European Union regulation would be supplemented by the Russian internal regulation, to which the European Union incentivizes Russia and other countries within the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I think that carbon border adjustment mechanism is not actually the best way to incentivize Russia to be greener. I think that the most possible, the most probable response from the Russian side, it's my expert opinion, I am not affiliated to any governmental agencies and so on. I think that the most possible probable response would not be the introduction of any climate regulation in Russia, but would be the response measures from Russia to the European Union, and it would the introduction of carbon border adjustment mechanism followed by response measures would provoke the other stage of the deterioration of Russia-European relations, and would provoke possible the other stage of trade wars, but not the progress in the green agenda. I think that Russia and the European Union have actually a lot of opportunities to cooperate in the green area, to cooperate in promotion of green technologies, to cooperate in emission reduction. But these opportunities are beyond this narrow framework of carbon border adjustment mechanism, within which Russia is considered as a bad guy in international climate change regime, and the European Union is considered as a good guy. Actually, there is a huge fault line, a huge asymmetry between the situation with emissions in OECD countries, including the European Union, and BRICS countries, including Russia. BRICS countries are countries who are net exporters of emissions embodied in trade. They are specialized in production and exports of carbon-intensive goods, and it is not their own choice. It is the result of international labor division, which was formed for the last decades. And the same situation is in China. The same situation is in India, in South Africa, who are together with Russia top 4 largest emitters of emissions embodied in trade in the world. At the same time, the European Union, the European countries are net importers of emissions embodied in trade. So they do not have a lot of emissions within their own territories, but they consume a lot of goods. They consume a lot of carbon-intensive goods. Many of these goods are imported from abroad. From where? From BRICS countries. And if you, for example, look at the carbon footprint of Sweden, here you may see it, you may see that consumption-based emissions in Sweden are 70% higher than production emissions in Sweden. And so this is the result of this specialization of the European Union on relatively cleaner goods and imports of relatively carbon-intensive dirty goods from abroad. Again, it is not the choice of individual countries. It is the result of international division of labor. And if the European Union goes to carbon neutrality, this gap would increase. And at the same time, the consumption of carbon-intensive goods would not decrease in the European Union. So it would be shifted to other countries like Russia, like China, like India, and so on. And I think that this situation should be considered in a more complex way. So we should look at the flows of carbon-intensive goods as a part of the global economic system. And don't consider it as a result of low ambitions of Russia or China or any other countries in the world. So the fact that Russia exports a lot of carbon-intensive goods to the European Union, and these goods have larger carbon footprint than in Europe in average, it is again the result of international division of labor, which was formed for the last decades. And to look at this as a result of Russian low ambitions is a little bit oversimplification. Though I agree that Russian ambitions in this area could be much, much higher. I think that this understanding of emission trade flows, emission-related trade flows in a more complex way, it would open much more area for cooperation as well. And the reduction of emissions to zero by the European Union would be not very useful and would not be very good for climate if these emissions are associated with the substitution of European goods by imports from other countries like Russia. And so I think that for global climate, it would be much more efficient if the future efforts which are consolidated now in the European Union, they would be directed not only to the emission reduction within the EU, but to the emission reduction in the countries which export goods to the European Union. It is a fact that it is much cheaper to reduce emissions in Russia than in the European Union and in the other Western countries per unit of emissions. And therefore, if there are some carbon reduction projects in Russia which are taken into account within the European trading system and emission trading system, and if the European companies have an opportunity to realize these projects in Russia and take into account within the EU ETS, it would be very good for the European economy because the European companies would have an opportunity to reduce emissions cheaper. It would be very good for Russia-European relations, and it would be very good for climate as well, because we will be able to reduce much more emissions with the same costs. Now the consolidation of future efforts of the European Union at reduction of emissions to zero at the territory which is responsible for 9% of global emissions, it is not very efficient way to confront climate change. I think that the much more efficient way is to reduce emissions where in those territories which are where it is cheaper to reduce emissions. And I think that the further cooperation of Russia and the European Union should concentrate on creation of such a system within which the emission reduction would be operated there where it is cheaper to reduce emissions. And it opens a huge area for dialogue and for further cooperation, and it would help Russia look at the greening of its economy as an opportunity, but not as a challenge. And it would help look at Russia from the European Union as an opportunity as well, but not as a threat to global efforts to cope with climate change. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, and the final, sorry, Ivan, I forgot the final remark. Actually, I understand that the general state of the Russian-European relations now is not very good for launching such a dialogue, especially given that there is the energy dialogue between Russia and the European Union is nearly frozen. But I think that we should remember the history, and we should remember the year 1970. When the Soviet Union and Germany and other European countries were not the greatest partners. But however, it was possible to launch in 1970 the huge deal of the century, the building of huge energy transport system, gas transport system, which became the core of Russia-EU relations for the next decades. And I think that we should move to the new EU-Russia deal, EU-Russia Green Deal, which would be, again, good for climate, which would be good for the EU-Russia relations, but this deal should be based on the dialogue, on the understanding of our common interests, and on the understanding of interests of climate as well. Again, the interest of climate is to build the system within which the emissions should be reduced there where it is cheaper to reduce emissions. Thank you. Again, sorry for coming back.
Thank you very much, Igor, for your optimism. Okay, so we got the diplomatic reflection and expert reflection. Now we are passing to a business discussion, proceeding with business discussion. With this, I would like to pass moderation to Mr. Florian Willershausen, the member of the board of CREON Group, for moderating this conversation from the business side. Florian, please, the floor is yours. You can take mine.
Okay, seems to be working. Okay, all right. Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Florian Willershausen. I'm with CREON and the CREON Group, also our private equity fund in Luxembourg, the CREON Energy Fund. I'm specialized on ESG-related topics and green financing, and what we are doing as a CREON Group is building bridges, basically, by localizing green technologies here in Russia and CIS, but also by accompanying Russian and CIS countries to other markets and opening the doors to new energy projects, renewables. That's what we're doing, and I think it's very important right now because the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that's a very relevant topic for Russian and European businesses. And that's one which requires actually building bridges and figuring out cooperation potential as from my point of view, better alternative to further conflicts, which could be also one of the consequences of the new discussions going on right now. Until we start the panel discussions, let me do some remarks. Well, of course, the CBAM matters for Russian business, no matter whether it comes in form of a VAT or in form of a customs duty, or whether importers of CO2 intensive products from Russia to the EU or from China to the EU will be forced to participate in the emissions trading systems established by the Europeans. And when we take into account that Russia exports goods worth of 133 billion euro to Russia, accounting for 40% of exports, then we can clearly see that this is an important topic for Russia and Europe, especially also Europe, because they rely on the products imported from Russia. Never forget that. When we have a look at the export structure, oil, gas, fertilizers, aluminum, steel, and coal, we can clearly understand what the central bank already stated in a study, that 73.8% of the value of the Russian exports to Europe will be affected by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And Igor Makarov mentioned that. All the estimations, how in detail will affect business, leave still room for interpretation. We do not know the exact mechanism of the CBAM, and there are a lot of questions whether only scope 1 or also scope 2 emissions will be counted, whether a company with investments in renewable energies will be allowed to trade off these positive effects to the climate against the CO2-based exports from Russia to the West. So there are a lot of questions to be answered. And this is from the political side right now, the perfect time to discuss that. And I, from a business perspective, as a businessman, do not like this blame game, which sometimes occurs around these topics. We should stop discussions how to defend against new regulations, but we should shape the discussion and participate in order to figure out cooperation potential. And this is basically what the business is doing already, what the companies are doing already, and that's what we're going to discuss today as well. So the basic question is here, whether or how this potential threat, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, could be turned into an opportunity for business and also for the European-Russian business relations. And this is what we'll discuss today with our panelists here from business. Let me introduce them all. We have with us Anastasia Lavrentieva. She's Managing Director of Gazprom Bank and responsible for all the green topics and also green finance issues and developments. We have Alexei Spirin. He is from N+ and Director of Environmental and Climate Risk, the Management Department. And we have my colleague Ernesto Ferlenghi, who is speaking today on behalf of the European Business Association, AEB. He's the chairman of the Green Initiative of the AEB, one of his subcommittees, the committee on green financing I am leading. At the same time, he's of course also working for a European company from the oil and gas sector, which is ENI, is the executive vice president responsible for Russia. So happy welcome to all of you. And before we go into the details of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I think it's worth to have first a small look at the status quo. And I would like to start, of course, ladies first, with Anastasia from Gazprom Bank. As one of the top banks, you have already a long history on financing industrial solutions leading to energy efficiency, new technologies, environmental efficiency, and so on. Maybe with a view to your portfolio and your clients' requests and where you have spent the money in the past couple of years, maybe you can distill some trends where you see indicators that the Russian industries are on a pathway towards decarbonization.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you for the invitation. The discussion was really thrilling, and I'm glad to be here and to have an opportunity to say a couple of words about the bank and our opinion. The concept of sustainable development underpinned our values and business processes long before it became widely spoken in the financial sector. And recently, Gazprom Bank made a significant step on its way to a more sustainable future. We established the Council for Sustainable Development, and I'm glad to see here Ernesto Ferlenghi, one of the independent council members. And we also adapted our SD policy recently. As for our clients' agenda, we have made a sort of research last year, and we found out that more than 50% of banks' major clients adhere to the sustainable development principles. And we understand that the transition from a conventional model of doing business to a sustainable one is a complex and tedious process for any sector of economy. However, it is obvious that the journey for the more sustainable future that we as a bank have embarked on is also the result of our strategy, which is follow the client. So we see that for clients, this agenda is highly important, and we try to gain momentum. And at present, over 60% of domestic projects in the renewable energy are realized with credit support from Gazprom Bank. Moreover, Gazprom Bank has established a leading Russian debt capital markets franchise across international and local markets. And now, not a couple, but a couple of dozens of our clients is looking into the opportunity to issue bonds in ESG formats. We also actively stimulate the transition of the largest polluting enterprises to the use of the best available technologies which reduce their negative impact. And taking into consideration all above said, we do believe that Russian industries are on a pathway towards decarbonization, and we are ready to assist.
All right, thank you, Anastasia. Maybe we pass the word to Alexei from InPlus, because you're one of the companies she might have mentioned. I'm not sure whether you're a client or not, but you may comment also on what you have done in terms of decarbonization as the owner of one of the largest aluminum producer, Rusal, but also other companies in the electricity sector. We have a lot of hydrogen projects. Maybe you give us an overview. What has changed in the past couple of let's say, past 5 years in terms of decarbonization in Russia already?
Thank you very much, Florian. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm representing EN Plus and EN Plus Group. EN Plus Group consists of two sectors. One of them is energy sector, and second one is metallurgical sector. And metallurgical sector consists mainly from UC Rusal assets. And UC Rusal is, it's largest worldwide producer of primary aluminum, and we have a lot of export of primary aluminum to Europe. CBAM, what we discussed now, is very important from primary aluminum export point of view. So we did a lot in terms of greenhouse gas emission strategy and reduction. So we set up strategic goals for UC Rusal. It was at the end of 2015, and at the moment we are going on in accordance to our goals. By the way, if we're talking about long-term goals, so I think I guess that our chair of board of directors, Lord Barker, recently announced the strategic goal for regarding climate change, 35% reduction by 2030, and to achieve net zero emission, to be carbon neutral by 2050. So, and we would like to announce our pathway, how we will do it in fall, in September. At the moment, we are preparing our pathway. So, if we would like to talk about direction, what we are at the moment applying for greenhouse gas emission reduction. So, from the energy production point of view, we still continue our long-term project related to improving efficiency of power generation at our hydropower plants. So our goals to increase power generation efficiency by 8%. So at the moment we achieved significant additional power production compared to previous power generation efficiency, and so we are telling that our additional power generation at our hydropower plants allow to replace around 2 million tons CO2 emissions from coal-fired power generators, because we replaced this electricity in the grid. In UC Rusal, our main goal to implement the modern inert anode technology at our smelters. At the moment, we have industry, full-scale pots which produce aluminum at the moment, and we are investigating how to improve technology to use these pots, and our plans replace over all of our aluminum smelters by new technology by 2050. So it's our goal. So it's just briefly about our main activities. Also, we considering, we understanding that no any kind of business and production business related to production, and especially if we're talking about aluminum production, nobody are able to fully eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. So in that case, it's also important to consider how to compensate or neutralize those kind of emissions which cannot be avoidable. So, and we are looking for nature-based solution for that. So we are looking for forest project, and in 2019 we started 2 pilot projects. One of them is reforestation project, and we planted in 2019 around 1 million trees in Siberia, in Krasnoyarsk region, and in Irkutsk region. And the second project was aviation fire forest protection forest from fire. So this project also has been started in 2019, and we continue this project. So we did it in last year, and we will continue this project this year and after, because it's necessary to maintain this project anyway. But we're thinking also to increase the areas, because at the moment in pilot stage we are protecting around 500,000 hectares in Krasnoyarsk region, and we're considering to increase amount of square of protection in the future. But also we are looking for other kind of project which will facilitate to preserve our boreal forest in Siberia.
Okay, we will return to the technologies and also maybe the forestation project a bit later. But one question, taking into account the investments you already made in terms of decarbonization, are you actually quite happy about the European Union's approach to start with CBAM, because it will swift out Chinese competitors from your European market?
I cannot tell word happy, because we do not clearly understand the rules at the moment. So in that case, we see a lot of risks related to this decision. But anyway, we are seeing also opportunities. But it will depend on the configuration of CBAM, how it will be. So and our position, of course, so CBAM need to address individual efforts of companies, despite of efforts of country, because each company has own attitudes and goals related to climate change, and of course it will be correctly to address individual efforts, and to be company specific, to use company specific approach by applying CBAM. For instance, if one company spend a lot of efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get improvements and achievements, so in that case, the company needs to be supported. So, and if we are talking about benchmark approach for export goods or products, whatever, metal for related to our business. So a benchmark needs to be applied for that, of course. And if our position, if carbon footprint of less than benchmark. So in that case, it should not only be a subject of additional payment for carbon tax or any kind of carbon fees, but probably it needs to be more motivated mechanism applied for that, like for instance, reduction or cancellation of import tax for such kind of low carbon goods.
Thank you. That are already some aspects for the more detailed discussions also with the regulatory institutions on both sides, which will be also taken up by Ernesto Ferlenghi. But Ernesto, when you came a bit later, and but my feeling when I listened to the speeches we had before, that this CBAM discussion could easily lead to a blame game, political conflict. We heard already that the Russian side is keen to fight it off at WTO. The European side says, well, Russia has to be more ambitious in terms of climate change mitigation and decarbonization targets. You are one of the most important intermediators. Actually, we are with our initiative between the EU and Russia, seeking to fuel the kind of cooperation and let it grow. How would you tackle this potential conflict topic and turn it into a topic of mutual benefit? How can Russian and EU companies in Russia benefit of the Green Deal?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's worked well, but yeah, thank you, Florian. Thank you, all of you. Let me see a few things. I mean, we recognize the role that Russia plays in terms of GDP. If you really take into account which is the level of GDP covered by Russia, you arrive at the level 1.7 of the worldwide. So this is one of the meta that has to be taken into account if you compare the commitment taken by the Russian Federation and you try to compare with the other country, covering, by the way, by 2% of the worldwide population. So this is one of the matter. Of course, we all of us recognize and know the level played by Russia in terms of oil production. So 70% of all the oil production comes from Russia, and even the same amount comes in terms of gas production. So it's very strong. I mean, energy producer, as we know. You know that 50% of commercial trade relation comes from export from natural resource to Europe. I want to recognize that if you compare, for example, the GDP of Europe, you see that the GDP of Europe is 12 times higher than Russia. So you expect that in terms of emission, you should be something, in terms of per capita emission, should be something aligned. While if you compare what's happened during the last 30 years, the level of per capita emission of CO2 equivalent in Russia is double of the European one. So this is the result of something that's happened in Europe and something that did not happen in Russia, by the way. This is one thing that you have to take into account. Let's look for a while what's happening in China, for example. From the 1990 from today, so in the last 30 years, then a level of emission of CO2 equivalent has been 4 times increased in China. Is another thing that has to be taken into account. Sometimes we heard in Russia they take it as a Paris Agreement commitment towards the reference to the 90 years, but we are comparing so different things. So Russia in the 90s was a former Soviet Union. So in the GDP covered by the former Soviet Union, where only 60% has been covered by Russia. So, I mean, it's not true that you can compare something of a GDP now and that level of the 90s. At the same time, you cannot compare the level of emission now and that time. It was 3.6 billion tons per year per year, while now it's 1.6, as we said. I'm saying that if you look at that, I mean, the commitment taken by Russia in terms of, let's say for a while on the renewables, for example, only 1.5% of energy comes from renewables in Russia, while in Europe, we already reached more than 30%. There is a country like Germany, when 40% during the last 3 years, 40% of energy has been created by the renewable. I'm not saying there is no case of a private company like Rusal, which, by the way, has incredible figures in terms of how their commitment towards the sustainability process. I mean, Rusal has, on average, the number 3 level less in terms of emission potential if you compare of average of the industry, because they produce mainly coming from the hydro and whatever. So it's a really wonderful case, but we have really few Russian case of company. I'm talking about private one. I'm not sure we can talk about the state one. Let's talk, for example, for the G20. There is only 2 countries in the world that has been not taking strong commitment in terms of reducing from the low point of view. This is Turkey and Russia. It's not a matter of you compare my ambition to start being more sustainable. Is the low part that has going to be implemented. We heard that there is 2 different draft laws under discussion in the Parliament of Russian Federation. That is very important. The first one is which create the basis for the monitoring of the emission. The second one is more located for the regional experiment of let's say, pilot project in the Sakhalin. That's very good. But if you don't introduce the specific tax mechanism for the emission of CO2 or the so-called trading emission, you are not get the point. So there will be long time in order to get that result that we got in Europe. So we started in 2005, means more than 15 years ago. So the long process will take in Russia, but still we do not see the results. Even probably because in Russia, when we talk about energy transition, sometimes they think that that is not going to bring to the energy efficient increasement and even to the more competitiveness of the company. So the logic is if you are more sustainable, if you are more, let's say, the energy efficiency will increase, you are more competitive on the market. This is the logic that should be used. Sometimes the Russian side say, why we should do that? If you compare with the 1990, we decreased already by 50%. Yeah, that can be true, but it's not true that you have compared something different. So this is not one thing. Of course, it has to be subsidiary. So we understand in Europe of what's happened, probably happened because specifically for the renewables, because we had the specific strong impact by the help of the financial sector of the coming from Brussels.
Get to that a bit later with another question. Okay. Yeah, but I would like to interrupt you just for a second to pass the question regarding the mechanisms to Alexei, because well, there are actually in the Russian discussion right now several options how to react on the CBAM. One is that one could try to sue the EU, the WTO. I mentioned that. Another thing would be to subsidize the losses from the state budget. But the rather long-term mechanisms would be either a Russian carbon tax or emissions trading systems, which, and that's, by the way, a question, should be, but the question is, can it be harmonized with those of the European Union as well? What's your take on that? What would you, from your company perspective, prefer, the ETS, the tax, or state support?
Good question. Thank you very much. So our position, despite of any carbon pricing mechanism, is quite clear. So this mechanism needs to motivate companies, industry, business to be more carbon neutral. And of course, it will not be such kind of mechanism. It not to be tough, very tough, just to kill business. So it should be some kind of balance between kind of from one side pushing mechanism, and from the other side, so some kind of motivation mechanisms and support. So despite of carbon tax or EU or ETS scheme, I guess, so it should be again balance between pushing and motivation. So for instance, from our point of view, it would be ideally if business will have financial neutral, what am I say? Okay, if will not if it will not lead to exceeding business expenditures. For instance, if the scheme will be configured like so, if you emit more than particular level, so and you may have choice to pay or to invest in own improvements just to reduce own emissions, or invest in improvements somewhere outside the company if it will be cheaper rather than paying for what am I say, exceeding amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So in that case, it will be possible to get money, I say, back, or to take this money, to use this money for own development. So it will be more interesting for business rather than if companies will pay somewhere to budget or for any reasons. So, and nobody knows how it will be after that, how this money will be used. And of course, it's considering as additional payments for business, and of course, such kind of activities treated as negatively treated, and considering in Russian business. Okay.
Yeah.
So if it will be possible to configure such kind of mechanism.
That is a good point to follow up with Anastasia, because well, the CBAM and its consequences for you as a bank or the financial sector in Russia might be, on the one hand, either a burden. Well, you have a lot of industrial clients working with you. They might face accruals, depreciations, declining profits and market value, and so on. So that's the one side. One perspective. The other could be that it will come along with investment in renewable energy, in green technologies, and actually the transition-related investments. Which of these perspectives do prevail right now, and maybe in a couple of years from now?
Yes, really, and I would like to say that I absolutely agree with that it's really important to elaborate balance mechanism. And as a bank, we participate in a number of working groups and expert groups during legislation elaboration, and we try to understand what are the solutions. And the CBM is a serious challenge, but what we need is an in-depth analysis of how to harmonize the recently elaborated Russian taxonomy for green and transition projects and the European one. And all these risks is, I would say, it's not a good driver in the long-term perspective. We believe that incentive measures would be more efficient. And for example, it concerns tax incentives for domestic and foreign investors, and these incentives could help to make green projects more attractive for investors. And we do see a growing appetite for green finance in Russia. Moreover, it's not only about, for example, green bonds, but also about sustainability bonds or sustainability-linked bonds, which means that sustainability-linked bonds, for example, when the issue sets KPIs, for example, to reduce emissions, and this will have also a sort of greening for investors. And we think that modern financial instruments, especially of capital market, would become an effective quick fix for our market.
Great, thank you. Well, generally speaking, for the North Pole and the ice bear, the polar bear whose flow is melting, it doesn't matter whether the Russians, the Germans, the Italians, or the Americans are to be blamed for that. Climate change and mitigating the risks related to it concerns us all. When we have a look to the European Union, Ernesto, you mentioned that, we see that actually billions of euros are spent in terms of creating an infrastructure for alternative fuels, for hydrogen, e-mobility, and so on. Talk about only 600 billion from the program of the EU. It helps the member countries to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. So Europe invests, but do you see any chance that in a, let's say, more geo-economic approach of the European Green Deal, neighbors and especially supplying countries such as Russia, suppliers of raw resources as of today, could somehow benefit from EU funding? Right now, we have to admit it's quite the contrary. We still have the sanctions, and even the development banks are not allowed to even finance renewable energy projects in Russia because of the sanctions, not to mention the private banks for which the market is totally closed. Do you see any opportunity to open that?
The last 30 years has been increased by 2 degrees. This is incredible high. The level of emission level of CO2 is increasing dramatically. We have to stop there. To stop, of course, the only solution we can put all together is, of course, investment, because we have to improve. We have to improve the technology efficiency, of course. I think this is the level of cooperation towards the final objective is the sustainable world first, and that the instrument we have to use is the innovation process of technology. In order to innovate the world and technology, we need, of course, investment. Let me say that if you want to reach the carbon neutrality until 2050, you have to invest more than $500 billion in Europe. This is what the estimation that has been done. Russia has been even more has to do. What I'm saying that if you start cooperation between EU industry and Russia, for example, there is, of course, I think space of cooperation in terms of how to localize production in Russia. This is one thing. We can start producing technology together here, using specific line of financial instruments that we have to do that. And I think nobody in Europe can, can object on that, on the specific methods of cooperation, because we use the financial instrument in order to improve the efficiency of the world, to cooperate more friendly, in order to, as a final goal, to decrease the level of emission. So through that mechanism of localization, creation of a joint venture in Russia, and only not talking about Russia itself, we can even talk about more wider about the Eurasian Economic Union, even if you want. So the main target is clear for everyone. Financial instrument has to be identified, and technology improvement and innovation has to be done. Only with that aim, if you even talk about hydrogen, for example, that you mentioned, 2050, 24% of the energy consumption will come from hydrogen. It needs massive investment, more than $200 million. Russia is full of gas. They can even export gas, and in the future, they can even export hydrogen in Europe. We are dramatically reducing the number of production in Europe. Why? We need energy. So this is the very ideal strategic cooperation between EU and Russia that I see.
All right, thank you. That might answer already one question we just received via the chat function. And by the way, you have the opportunity to also ask your questions via the chat or raise your hands to give a short statement. We are almost at the end of our discussion. The question that was here in the chat is whether other companies or also which other companies could benefit from a cooperative dialogue, apart from those who are lucky to rely on hydrogen, on hydro-based electricity supplies. So the hydrogen industry in general, that's of course a very important topic for Russia. We're also working with CREON and Faris Kilsi a lot on these hydrogen projects and figure out how to make commercially viable projects available that solves at the same time also the challenge of switching the energy system totally into a in future zero carbon one. So this is of course a big topic. Anastasia, you mentioned in that context the green financing products. I would like to ask you at the end if you also have to leave. Well, right now it's like there's a large demand of for green financing products, financial products in Europe. Even in Europe, it's exceeding the offers in terms of projects that are bankable and green in terms of the green finance frameworks. How is it like in Russia? So in Europe, we can expect that green bonds in some time from now will be cheaper than conventional bonds. Do you see that in Russia as well?
Thank you for the question, and I would say that here in Russia there are fewer sources of demand for green projects than in other countries, and moreover, the largest potential issues for them do not experience pressure from society or investors, unlike Europe. And this limits the range of projects that require green financing. And there is one more thing we should take into account, and Nesta has already mentioned, that the Russian capital market is comparable to the global ESG bond market. And so on the one hand, the main limitations of the Russian market is the insufficient number of projects and insufficient triggers for industry to make such projects. And we think that it is the state that will create the interest, that should create the interest from both investors and issuers. And a systemic solution for this problem can be the beginning of a full-scale transformation of business strategies of the largest companies in our country. If the state develops, as I have already said, incentive measures, the growth may happen.
Okay, thank you. What I can add just briefly from the perspective of the Luxembourg Private Equity Fund, European investors seem to be very interested in going into green bonds or green financial products, even in Russia. And it seems to be the perfect way to do invest in projects without violating any sanctions or even the perception of sanctions. They should be, of course, abandoned in some time from now. But green projects in Russia can be financed from Europe to some extent as well. I got the confirmation from financial market players all the time that the appetite is there. One very last question until we go further. Alexei, there has been a question on the Chinese technology transfer. It's not really our topic, but please a short answer generally on the technology transfer. So do you expect that the Chinese-Russian relations might gain benefit of that, or is it rather that this will remain a Russian modernization topic and does not affect the European relations?
Can you please just a little bit more explain about your question, because what kind of technology do you mean? Because so we have primary aluminum production technologies, and so your question related to that, or just?
It's not my question, and the question on the question is probably a good question, because this is about whether Chinese technology transfer could be pushed through the CBAM discussions. Do you? Let me formulate the question on my own, because I don't know the context here. So, do you rely on Chinese technologies? Do you think that they could push you forward in terms of modernization and efficiency, or are these rather your own Russian technologies or the European technologies you rely on?
Okay. So, what I must say, of course, we are looking for any new technologies that is appeared and developed worldwide, and of course, China is one of the country where it's quite widely, happen. I mean, new technologies also appeared, and of course, if we see anything interesting there, and so we are investigating. Would it be possible to apply it in Russia, of course? And of course, it's quite positive, and that China are looking forward also for low carbon technologies at the moment, and they are thinking also how to reduce carbon footprint of own aluminum and to be more sustainable in future. So we are thinking that it's a positive direction for everybody, and of course we have some kind of collaboration with Chinese colleagues regarding new technologies, and we also visiting Chinese plants and, for instance, power generation facilities to take more new ideas.
Okay.
So it's a positive, it's a good way.
We'll see. So you answered diplomatically, but the topics lying ahead of us, dealing with the European-Russian relation and with the CBAM, hopefully we'll make some achievements in future. We'll continue these discussions with you and with all of us. And now we continue our event with the next speeches. Yep. So, Ivan.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you for brilliant moderation. So the plan is the following. We now have two expert comments from our guests from GIMO, and we already have announced from the audience. So the plan is simple, right? I'm passing the floor to Elena Alexandrovna Maslova, the senior research fellow from the Center for European Research in GIMO University. Please. Well, I point out just one of many of your titles, so there are much more in the program. So please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, as far as we have limited time, I would like to concentrate on the following issues. First, that there's a kind of paradox that at both the global and national levels, which are interconnected, surely Russia is not only included in the environmental agenda, but also politically supports fully the emerging global green consensus. And it all started in 1994, as we know it well, when Russia ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and then Kyoto Protocol, and then Paris Agreement, and now we have National Climate Change Adaptation Plan for the first phase for the period 2020-2022. And in this way, we have a new concept of so-called adaptation to climate change, which appeared in Russian discourse and in Russian law also. And in this way, a new concept of adaptation to climate change is about ensuring adaptation, in particular a system of targets and statistical indicators, methodological recommendations on climate risk assessment and so on. That is what our government is doing now. But as far as it was already said that the plans, ecological plans of Russian Federation is heavily criticized not only by the European colleagues but also by environmental community and Russian environmental community for its lack of ambition, because these levels of commitments compared to 1990 do not imply a real environmental breakthrough. And if we briefly, so in the national level and on a global level, the agenda is positive. But if we briefly examine Russia's climatic and environmental situation, we find out that the case does not appear to be optimistic. And one can also say that the ecological and climatic situation is unfavorable, even depressive in some regions of Russian Federation. And the structure of greenhouse gas emissions by sector has remained stable over the last decades, with the energy sector accounting for around 80%. And emissions of air pollutants are in close correlation, surely, with the structure of the country's economy. So according to the recent data, the largest sector in terms of emissions was the manufacturing industry and mining. And at the same time, experts assume that Russia is warming 2.5 times faster than the global average due to its northern latitude. And in 2020, temperatures in the Arctic Circle hit new record levels. While we have another environmental problems, such as the pollution of water bodies by industrial waste, rubbish, flooding, melting of permafrost, illegal logging, forest fires, and increasing quantities of environmental accidents and natural disasters. So that caused significant damage not only to the economy, not only to infrastructure, but also to population. But at the same time, if we think about people, and if we talk about population and ecology as a value, in the eyes of Russian society, it could be stated that in a post-industrial society, ecology as a value for a population, for people, can be claimed only when the basic need for security and economic well-being is met. And ecology is one of the components of the quality of life, and ecology is a value which is not on the ground level of the imaginary pyramid of values, and it's difficult to think about ecology when you have economic problems. So that's the case of Russia. And just to put some interesting data, in October 2020, a sociological survey was carried out in Russia. And among other things, the data revealed that more than 60% assess the ecological situation in Russia as favorable. And I would say that the majority of Russians, however, do not seem to be concerned really about concerned with environmental issues. This is indirectly confirmed by another survey stating that, just think that more than half of the Russians, 63%, have never heard of the eco-activist Greta Thunberg. 63%, never heard. They do not know, have no idea who is that girl or a boy, maybe for them. So for Russia, as I already said, and all the participants said, that the Paris Agreement does not pose a serious threat as far as it's not Russian targets are not so ambitious. And against the European Union's Green Deal might pose a bigger challenge for Russia, although Russia is not taking part in it and is not making any commitments. So Russia is a participant without participation in Green Deal, actually. And above all, this is due to imminent drop in demand for Russian energy, implying a significant reduction of revenue for the Russian budget. And by the way, pivot to this will not work here because Asian countries, they also claim to achieve carbon neutrality, even China by 2060. And another problem for Russian side is already mentioned carbon tax. So today, I would say that Russia is at a crossroads, and the Russia-European relations will depend highly on the path Russia chooses, because the EU has already made its choice, and Russia and the EU members are still linked culturally and economically in some way, but this economic link is and will continue to be weakened by the EU's declining energy imports. And there is a hope on this EU-Russia green dialogue that it has the potential to create new bridges, but this green dialogue could also create new conflicts. So Russia is at crossroads nowadays, and we'll see what will happen. Thank you.
Well, the world is in the crossroads, actually. So Natalia Arkadievna, this was yours, a professor of the Department of International Economic Affairs and Foreign Economic Ties, relations, right, at MGIMO, please.
That's it? Thank you very much. First of all, I will try to avoid the matters already discussed, and I'll try to go directly to the essence. The views even on why the Green Deal and BCA, border carbon tax, the views of Russia and the European Union, even on that matter, partly are not the same, at least. Yes, the first slide. Thank you very much. And from the European Union point of view, the main idea is the competitiveness of the European companies. And because of that, European Union is trying to eliminate carbon leakage. By the way, up to now, there was no significant carbon leakage stated in the European Union. And the other idea is to encourage other countries to take similar measures to combat the emissions. But almost immediately, passing to maybe to the first part, from Russian point of view, we're speaking not about the maintaining but gaining competitive advantages by European companies. In the period when there is a great energy transformation of the global economy, actually. That's the main point. Then actually, from Russian experts' point of view, political considerations are above all in that case about border carbon tax. Including increasing independence from foreign supplies, switching to products produced in Europe. From European point of view, they're trying to reduce their dependence on energy imports from one country. I don't think that you need now slides about the dependence. Everyone knows how big this dependence is. And then another ground is that the carbon tax is an additional source of income. From Russian point of view, it's the same. You see the blue color points the convergence of views on that matter. The other point is the recovery from the COVID recession. The post-COVID package of European Union includes measures to combat climate change. From Russian point of view, it's the main point is unfair aspect of this taxation. Could you please pass 2 slides and come to the 4th slide? This one, then rotate, please. No, the next one. The next one. This one. That's when we heard today that the European GDP is much less and has much less energy carbon content. But by the way, the European Union developed partly thanks to greater accumulated natural resources and greater accumulated CO2 emissions. And as you see from the slide, the European Union takes the 2nd place after USA by accumulated emissions up to now. And Russia's part is only 6% in accumulated emissions. From Russian point of view, the economic development and including technological development, first of all, was reached very much thanks to this point. That's why, from Russian point of view, it's unfair just to levy this tax. There are 2 points which are coinciding. It's about competitive advantages. By the way, the idea of could you please show 1 slide before? The European Union is a leader, is definitely a leader in environmental goods and services. For example, the last year is 2018, when the production of environmental goods was almost $1 trillion. It's 800 billion for 28 members of the European Union, and for 27 members, it's 700 something. I don't see from my place, sorry. Then the 2nd point is about risks and benefits. The main, could you please pass the next slide? In a slide. Thank you very much. The main risk for European Union is very high cost of Green Deal. Because according to the last estimates of, as far as I remember, McKinsey, European Union needs to pay 22% of GDP of 2019 to realize the Green Deal, 22%. Any funds, although right now the European Union allocates plans to allocate unprecedented funds to accomplish the deal, they are still short of their plans. They don't have such investments at this moment. Maybe then, when the new investments and now the matter on the global level, the main matter is redirecting the investment. And in case of redirection of all the investments in traditional energy sources, it will be maybe it will cover 80% of the needed investment. And the other point is the negative impact for competitive of BCT for competitive advantages of all European producers. Could you please, for a moment, show the next slide? For example, judging by no, not this one. No, maybe the next one. Maybe the next one. Yes. Actually, if we take into account the whole value chains of European producers, they will all suffer from border carbon tax, because in the end, they have to pay this tax themselves. And then there are possible negative impact for European consumers, because carbon tax is rather high, and they have to pay it in the end. That means higher consumer prices and lower living standards in the European Union. There are new risks, by the way, for energy security of the European Union. One slide before. New risks for the energy security, because new sources of energy demand large quantities of other raw materials consumed. For example, new metals and minerals. For example, lithium-ion batteries. According to calculations, European Union needs to import 18 times more lithium and up to 2030, and 60 times more lithium up to 2050. And the biggest supply is China. So there will be new dependence, not from oil and gas, but from lithium. And if we take the overall impact of all these measures to environment, we have to calculate, because maybe it's even more dangerous. And more dangerous definitely from energy supply point of view. Then about retaliation measures by trade partners, but somebody spoke about it, and we won't touch this matter. Then there are difficulties, other difficulties. Could you please show the slide before? Return to the former slide. Thank you. Then there may be problems of ineffectiveness of BCT to tackle climate change in the absence of measures in the other countries, or maybe in more mild measures. Although I think that gradually other countries will do the same. I don't mean BCT, but I mean the measures for decarbonization. And there is one technical difficulty, is how to calculate carbon content throughout the whole global value, the whole value chain. Although this issue is one can overcome. But there are definitely benefits for European companies of gaining new competitive advantages. We don't speak about improving the environment, and for Russia, it's well known that the main two risks is the gradual loss of energy markets, and not only for energy, but for carbon-intensive product markets as well. The BCT as it is, so we have to pay. And the further technological lag in restructuring the economy. And the main benefit, the core benefit of the measures taken is modernization of the economy and new export opportunities, creating new industries and creating new export opportunities. That's the main advantage. There are other advantages as well. Is that in the short term, in the short to medium term, up to 2030, when the coal will be gradually substituted by natural gas, the Russian companies, first of all, gas supplying companies, may even increase the supplies for European companies, but it's only in the short to medium term. We should think strategically. The other positive point is avoiding carbon tax and participating in the trade of quotas for Russian companies. It depends on what mechanism will be introduced to reduce carbon content of emissions in Russia. Then there may be potential investments for Russia because, as far as I remember, 10% of Green Deal funds and post-COVID funds as well will be directed to internationalization of the deal. That means to overseas investment. And there may be projects, joint projects, to maybe to realize this idea. Improving the environment and political dividends, we don't discuss. Then what it's about the opportunities. The main opportunity there are 2 points I want to stress. First of all, next one. Thank you. First of all, that the cooperation definitely shouldn't be limited to climate issues, but may encompass other issues as well of improving the environment. But definitely the energy cooperation is the core idea, the core sphere of cooperation. The most important, from my point of view, is investment cooperation, primarily in research and development, production, and infrastructure. We're speaking about joint projects, and it was mentioned already today and not once. From my point of view, the main area is maybe hydrogen projects. Because if we spoke about last 2 centuries, it was actually carbon energy sources. And the 21st century was planned to be hydrogen energy source. And although IRENA and some other sources estimate that by 2050, the share of hydrogen in energy balance will be about from 12 to 14%, I think that it will be higher because there are definitely limitations to RES projects. And maybe hydrogen projects are the most important, considering the fact that it was already partly mentioned today, because of Russia's competitive advantages, geographical proximity, developed infrastructure, natural gas development, etc. So maybe from my point of view, it should be the main area of cooperation. And there are other areas of cooperation as well. About the forecast, I hope that maybe somehow we'll try to develop common grounds on this point, and the risks are very high. The main risks, from my point of view, is the further mistrust. The sanctions is not the core problem. The core problem is the mistrust between the two sides. And it will be further mistrust between the parties and further orientation of the ties of Russia, in spite of many mutual, first of all, cultural grounds of two sides' relations. So cooperation in the environmental and including climate sphere, I think can be mutually, definitely mutually beneficial and become one of the main areas for the discussion and for the realization of the project. There should be a dialogue but maybe transparent and honest dialogue on this point. Maybe trying to write some roadmap, including concrete steps how to realize this cooperation area. Sorry for taking so much time. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Natalia Arkadievna. So we have already exceeded our schedule, but we have no problem. No problem. This is always accumulating, right? From statement to statement. So at the end, the last speaker suffers most. So we have just one small question from the Institute of Research and Expertise of Web. But just please brief. Who would you like to ask the question?
No, I wanted to ask, but he left.
And
but you placed me on his place.
So you would answer your question, right?
Yeah, and if you allow 2 minutes for some remarks.
Yeah, not more, please.
Not more. Something. Which is a development institution. On 18th of November last year, WEB was appointed by the government as the methodological center for green finance. A couple of days ago, a center of green economy and climate was established in WEB, and I'm in charge of the green finance part of this. And that's why I would say that during last year, a lot of things were done. First, the package of the documents of the infrastructure for the green finance was approved by the interministerial group, head by Minister of Economy, and we hope that not later than in June, the taxonomy, methodological recommendations and verification system will be approved by the government. And it is absolutely clear intention to move in this direction. Green finance is the thing which is written openly in the Paris Agreement. The system should rechannel the funds from one direction to another direction. It means where to channel. That's why we talked about taxonomies. I would not agree that our society is not environmentally sensitive, vice versa. It is a tremendous pressure from the population for environmental issues. Clean air, first, clean water, clean land, clean country. There is absolute negligence for the climate issues, and it causes problems because people who breathe with the polluted air, they don't care what will happen in 30 years. They just don't care. Then, when we wrote the taxonomy, we have two parts of it. The green taxonomy, which is absolutely corresponds with the European one, and the CBI, ICMA taxonomies, we took into account Chinese one, and the transition, which is more down to earth, which allows us to fix the real problems of the most urgent problems of the Russian economy. What is reducing of carbon emissions is energy efficiency, it's resource efficiency, it is new technologies, energy technologies and new industrial technologies. Who is against this? People would vote for this and people would support it. Of course, it is pressure for their business. Nothing can be done without extra expenditures. Only in fairy tales, just someone, magician, comes and switches your economy. And it is a long work and very intensive work within the different agencies of the government and business and society and environmental, ecological funds and such like to move to this direction. We cooperate with Gazprom Bank and meet very regularly with them, with Sberbank, how to finance it, how to do it more coherent. Then I did not had any intention to talk until Florian asked the man who left, unfortunately, Ernesto Ferlenghi, the question about the investments and sanctions. I hear these talks at least since Madrid summit, and they were repeated by Timmermans in, I think it was late 20, when it was a summit conference in Skolko, EU-Russia energy conference in Skolko. And Mr. Timmermans said, well, probably we should do that, the ecological projects or the climate projects would have some sort of waiver from the sanctions. Nothing was done and nothing is intended to be done. I think, again, it is, and I became much more skeptical about this issue, and even after this conference, I became more skeptical than before, because the language which EU speaks now, one cannot call it cooperative. It's something else. Something, well, again, we developed it, take it, it's yours. And no possibility to discuss. On the 23rd of March, British Ministry of Finance had a discussion on this CBAM. And it was open for listening. Member of the Europe, discussion is going on. Member of the European Parliament jumps and says, okay, I have to go because Chinese are absolutely against this and I have to talk to them. Then one after another, guy from US, New Zealand, Australia, speaks. Okay, guys, it's very nice that you want to do something better for your economy. But before introducing something, could you talk to us? Because it was not discussed at all. It is not discussed even now. It is 23rd of March, less than 1 month before. And it is not some conference in Russia or something else. It's a round table discussion, several discussions in UK. And the unanimous opinion of these people, if you only introduce tax, 100% it is against the WTO regulation, 100%. Something else you can play, but how it will be done, I think that the bureaucrats from EU, they confused themselves in this. On the same conference in Skolkovo, the colleague of our speaker from Rusal, Andrei Bazylev, said that, well, guys, you introduce new tariffs on aluminum. You don't produce aluminum. You understand what will happen. We'll raise prices. everyone will raise prices. US tried to do this. And this is what they ended up to, minus 10,000 of jobs and high price. You want to do this? It's very thin and very dangerous instrument. Finishing this, my remark. Russia will do decarbonizing, modernizing its economy with or without EU. In any case, it's imperative. If the sake of this exercise is climate, is reduction of emissions that follow the way which Igor Makarov showed today, investment in Russia, they are 10 times more efficient than investment in EU. But you don't do this. Maybe you have different intentions, not only climate, or not climate at all, if you do this. And suspicion rises because of the inconsistency of the words and behavior. Absolutely right. And I agree with Natalia that mistrust and mutual suspicion is the core of this. But they are raised by the inconsistency in words and deeds. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for kind remarks. So, dear colleagues, with this, I would propose to finish our today's meeting. This is an ongoing project. We are going to continue our work on these rim problems, ecology, climate, etc. So I trust that we will be able to see each other more here in this room and in this system too. So I look forward to our further cooperation and support, and thanks to you for your brilliant moderation of the business session. Let's continue our collaboration. Thank you. Stay healthy.